Shuhei Yoshida says Jim Ryan fired him from PlayStation Studios, quote, because I didn't listen to him. And that is, that one set the internet off earlier today, as you would expect. And it's coming from a talk that he had a few days ago at the 2026 Australian Games Festival. And he was just there to talk about indie games, but part of that was him recounting his history, especially at Sony, where people know him very, very well, obviously. A 31-year PlayStation veteran. But during this time, he did talk a bit about Jim Ryan, who, after today, probably had that chill out on the beach, of course, hanging out in retirement. That chill where he's like, "Oh, who's talking about me?" Well, today, most of the internet, and we're gonna go over exactly why. So if you guys enjoy the video, hit the like button, subscribe if you're new. So this is over on This Week in Video Games, who I seems to be just attended this talk and transcribed and tried to at least describe even the mood as all this was going down. And I think that's kind of important here to note because I would like to see a recording of this talk, and I assume Australian Games Festival would have recorded this presentation, especially if you get Shuhei Yoshida out there to talk for what I can only assume was maybe an hour about indie games, and it seems like it was mostly him talking about what he believes makes a good video or a good indie game, good video game, but a standout one. And again, in order to do that, he introduces himself, talks about his history, saying, I helped Sony Santa Monica to make God of War, Naughty Dog to make Uncharted, and The Last of Us, and Sucker Punch to make the beautiful Ghost of Tsushima. Ghost of Tsushima was one of the last games that I worked on as the president of Worldwide Studios. But in 2019, after 11 years leading the first-party development, I was fired from the role. Jim Ryan wanted to remove me from first party because I didn't listen to him. And I will say, when you read those quotes out loud, it's like, oh, Shuhei's taking some shots right now at Jim Ryan. But if you read a little further here, with the context, he said that jovially, prompting laughter from the audience. He asked to do some ridiculous things, and I said no. So I do think, though, although Shuhei kind of seems like that anyway, where he's like, trying to, I guess, have some levity to the situation when he's describing something that happened now, like 7 years ago, maybe. So with that in mind, and he's recounting this, and he's clearly moved on. He's not at PlayStation any longer. He's not, I don't think, looking back on it with scorn and still holding on to like revenge or something. It seems like he's pretty happy with what he's doing now and is kind of, I guess, at peace with everything that's happened here. But if you think back on 2019, when they were preparing Sony to launch the PlayStation 5, of course, it takes years and years of preparation and R&D to put a system together. So midway through, we'll say 2019, yeah, they were getting ready to show off this system and have like a year of marketing and setup for November 2020. And in that time, Jim Ryan comes in, takes over for Sean Layden, which the whole thing around that sounded crazy as it is, because it did seem that the breakup with Sean Layden and Sony wasn't exactly amicable. There was a lot of descriptions and accounts of people being escorted out of the building, and it was a whole thing. But Sony went with Jim Ryan to lead the way, and 2019 he comes in. And I guess right then and there, he's talking to Shuhei, and he says there were some, Jim Ryan wanted to remove me from first party because I didn't listen to him. He asked to do some ridiculous things, and I said no. So I think back to 2019. What ridiculous things would Jim Ryan ask Shuhei to do that he would go, no, I'm not going to do that? Some people were saying, oh, obviously the live service stuff. And Shuhei has been on record going, I mean, the live service stuff isn't exactly what I would have been jumping at, 12 live service games or whatever. But it is important to note, Shuhei said he greenlit Concord. Like, he was there and went, yes, we're going to attempt this Concord game. We will start to fund it. That's not to say he was there, obviously, and seeing the rest of the development after the green light. That would have been Herman Holst, who thought it was their Star Wars. So, good job there, Herman Holst. But with that in mind, Shuhei did at least understand why the live service stuff was a thing. There is a lot of upside there if you can get it right. I actually think this is more on the side of Sony, of course, we'll say in the last 5 years, obviously. no stranger to just shutting down studios if they feel like they have to. All right. I mean, the Blue Point one, I think, was a big aha moment for people. But even before that, think back to 2019. What happened not even a year later? We start to hear about how talent was leaving Japan Studio. And then the following year, Japan Studio shuts down. And they do reform somewhat and restructure and become Team Asobi. And that was their big push was, hey, let's get behind Astrobot, which, hey, to their credit, Team Asobi, Astrobot, Game of the Year, that worked out well. But it's not the Japan Studio that people remember from PS2, PS3, or PS4 days, where you just had some very creative and random games come out of that studio. They didn't sell the best, but they had, I'd say, some really, really interesting ideas and game mechanics. All right. And now I think we're seeing, with the movie industry becoming more and more involved with gaming, they're looking for those weird and strange games and ideas to then convert over onto the big screen. I mean, we're hearing about a Gravity Rush show. So, like, stuff with that in mind makes sense now more than ever to attempt. But Japan Studios is gone. So I do wonder if that was something that was mentioned. It's like, hey, we're changing some directions here with what we want to do with Sony and PlayStation. And part of that is we kind of have to move away from Japan Studios because they're not making a bunch of money necessarily. It wouldn't shock me if Shuhei was like, I don't really want to be a part of that. No, it's not working for me. Because I mean, it does appear that what they ended up doing was making an entire job or just position for Shuhei to go off and do indie stuff, right? He says, because I grew up with Jim from the PS1 days, you don't want to have one of your friends as one of your subordinates. Because everybody in the company knew how much I loved indie games, Ryan offered Yoshida the role to focus on improving PlayStation support for indie development. He says, I really enjoyed the role of promoting these indie games. And I mean, that makes sense for Yoshida because he goes on and he talks about what makes indie games successful and then just notes a bunch of different indie titles. Journey, Before Your Eyes, Dead Cells, Nine Souls, Inscription, Doki Doki Literature Club, Ball Pit, Viewfinder. I mean, as I mentioned, he definitely spends a lot of time in the indie scene, plays a lot of those games, and just gets a kick out of it. He does mention here, though, check this out, okay? I'm free to show up on any podcast. Now I can talk about Nintendo, Xbox, Steam, and I get to see how Nintendo and Xbox support indies, so it's very, very cool. Any podcast, hey, click R3's out here, Yoshida. I mean, come on by, Shuhei. We got you. We'll move the time slot around to get you on there. But it'd be interesting to talk with Shuhei about, I mean, kind of some of this stuff, sure, but just in general, his view on, I think, the gaming industry now more than ever. I'd be so interested to see what he thinks about a lot of the stuff going on. But I do understand these quotes. I mean, look, I was fired from the role. Jim Ryan wanted to remove me from first party because I didn't listen to him. Ridiculous things were asked. It did seem like he was saying that kind of in a joking or lighthearted manner. I have a feeling, though, when this was going down, it wasn't as lighthearted or joking. And yeah, I mean, yeah, he was removed. He was removed from his position and was given the indie role instead. Herman Hulse coming in, and that's just kind of where we are now. And it's so the generation for Sony, right? Especially the PlayStation 5, but the Jim Ryan era, people just don't like Jim Ryan as it is. So this was a powder keg ready to go off then when these quotes went out there for the internet. But Jim Ryan had been around with PlayStation for a long, long time. It's just since the 90s and had a lot of success in Europe. It's just when he took over PlayStation, like at the top, some of the decisions that were being made, especially with the live service stuff, just didn't seem great. And as we're seeing now with a lot of that stuff being canceled, studios being shuttered, and I think the biggest fault was buying Bungie. I mean, that set them back. And while they have been successful this generation, a lot of that is, I would even say, attributed to definitely third-party live service because they collect so much money from Fortnite and others. It's obscene, right? Half of the revenue that comes through the PlayStation storefront are these live service games that Sony has no real part in. But even beyond that, it's kind of the stumbling of Xbox that's also caused Sony to be this successful. And eventually they will have to compare themselves to themselves in this time period with the PS6 or eventually the PS7, which I assume will exist someday. And that's going to be much more difficult. So Jim Ryan, he did retire. He got out in he announced his retirement in 2023 and then left in 2024 and it was like 30 years or something at PlayStation. He went out in his mind on top and probably doesn't even pay attention to anything happening online with PlayStation. Nothing like that. And he's on a beach somewhere just kind of hanging out right now. But what an interesting thing to see pop up randomly like first thing in the morning. Shuhei saying he was fired because he didn't agree with some of the stuff that Jim Ryan was saying or the direction they were going with. And I do believe him. And I think that was the big inflection point then for Sony coming out of the PS4 era, going into the PS5 generation. But let me know what you guys think about this one down below in the comments. What was your first thought without the context of him kind of saying it in a funny or joking way? When he said, Jim Ryan wanted to remove me from first party because I didn't listen to him. Because the internet went crazy when these quotes got out there. Thanks, guys, for watching, and I'll see you next time.